In this lesson, we will take a look at another of the most commonly used tasks that you'll encounter on the critical reasoning format problems of the verbal reasoning section of the GMAT focus, and that's going to be those asking you to weaken an argument. So first, let's talk about how we will identify weaken the argument task. First, of course, the prompt is going to include some sort of argument that is referenced in the question stem. You may also see just an oblique reference to a conclusion. You'll also note some task words such as weaken itself, obviously, undermine, and doubt. And you'll have new information provided in the answer choices that must be assumed true. So it'll say, which of the following, if true, most undermines the argument, something of that phrasing. Strategically, these are also going to be some of the most straightforward critical reasoning tasks. You'll begin by reading the prompt and identifying the nearly explicit conclusion of the argument that's provided, and then you'll want to categorically identify the type of argument to broadly predict a possible attack. You'll want to focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate incorrect options as always. And of course, you can eliminate more quickly as soon as a choice matches your proactive prediction. So you should recognize our argumentation equation, whereby our premise, the facts, plus the assumption or assumptions, the unstated facts, lead logically to some sort of subjective opinion or conclusion or claim. Now, how do we weaken an argument? Well, you need to locate additional information in one of the choices to show that an implicit assumption linking the premise to the conclusion is unlikely to be true for some reason. Now, your arguments can be categorized in multiple ways, but by focusing closely on the specifics and possibly identifying a clear category of argument, you can more closely predict how a choice could undermine the claim based on the type of premise that is within that argument. Now, our common argument attacks starting with an analogy whereby the argument is basically just saying that A is equal to B. So an analogy argument is always going to assume that the items in the argument are comparable in relevant ways. So a likely attack to an analogy-based argument is going to identify relevant differences in the items. Now, a representation style argument assumes that the evidentiary sample is representative of the larger whole population in the conclusion. And a likely attack here will often highlight subtle term shifts from the evidence to the conclusion to show that your provided sample is not necessarily representative of the overall population referenced in the conclusion. So let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning style problem and see how we can identify a weakened task and then find a common attack. So first, we've got to recognize the key term indicating a weakened task, in this case, undermine. So I just kind of write out undermine or weaken as my task on the scratchpad. Then we'll read the prompt as presented, noting the type of evidence provided to possibly recognize a common argument. So here you'll note there's some terms that are shifting. And so if we read, looking to artists for political insights is largely a fruitless endeavor. Most statements made by great artists indicate that creativity and political acumen rarely go together. In fact, most great artists hold political views with no more nuance than those of the average citizen. And so we got to identify our conclusion, and the conclusion is the very first statement, that looking to artists for political insights is largely a fruitless endeavor. And then we have the evidence provided afterwards. But that evidence is about great artists, and it is used to produce a conclusion about artists generally. So we can broadly predict, based on a kind of faulty sample, what the correct answer should do to weaken the argument by identifying a representation style argument that we need an answer to show the views and political insights of great artists are not representative of the political insights of artists more generally. So now we'll introduce our answer choices, because we don't really pay attention to those until we do our pre-work in the prompt. And we'll process of eliminate based on our common wrong argumentation reasons, including vague impacts. So choice E, some great artists harbor political aspirations. Wonderful. That doesn't clarify anything for anybody, so we can eliminate choice E pretty immediately. Then we've got political acumen is a vaguely defined concept for many. Okay, again, many. Does that mean artists or not artists? I don't know, so we're going to eliminate choice D as well. We also see choice B, great artists can draw large audiences for their commentaries on many contemporary issues. That doesn't say whether their views are good, though. And that can draw large audiences. Just because they can draw large audiences, does that mean that they have political insight or not? I don't know. That's vague. And it also kind of needs additional information as another categorical problem. Then we also have to be aware of task reversal. So in this case, something that would strengthen rather than weaken the claim. And choice A, an average citizen does not, on average, hold particularly nuanced political views. Well, that's saying that the great artists do not have nuanced views. And if anything, this actually strengthens the argument, even though it doesn't fix the assumption that we identified of the term shift between artists and great artists. But it does say that great artists have non-nuanced views because the average citizen they are being compared to in the argument does not have nuanced political views. But if we look at choice C, the struggles experienced by most artists make them very familiar with many political issues. Even though many is kind of vague, it says the struggles experienced by most artists and makes them familiar with many political issues. Well, that shows that they'd have some political thoughts and potentially have more political insights, thereby weakening the conclusion to start the argument, and we'd select rather choice C as our correct answer, understanding that by expediting the process with a common argument, you'll be able to not only go a little bit more quickly, but you'll hopefully be a little bit more accurate as well. So going back to some of our common arguments, we'll continue with data and evidence interpretation. And a data and evidence interpretation argument is going to assume that there is no other reasonable interpretation of the data or evidence. And your likely attack is going to provide additional data or numbers or evidence to support an alternative interpretation of the information. Now, the last two common arguments are the most likely ones that you'll see on the exam, and just about everything that we've listed so far can be categorized as a causality if we really want to, and aren't going to be as specifically focused on the type of evidence presented. But a causality just means that A led to B and that there are no other possible causes or outcomes, and the circumstance is not merely a coincidence. So the likely attack here should identify another likelier cause or outcome, possibly by making the circumstance seem coincidental. While a plan or recommendation common argument is going to assume that the execution approach will work. And we know that the conclusion of all plan or recommendation based arguments is that the plan or recommendation will be executed. And the assumption is that it's going to work. So our likely attack will provide information to show that the execution of the plan or recommendation will, in fact, not result in success as defined by the argument. Remember to always check for the specifically defined metric of success when you're evaluating plan or recommendation arguments on the GMAT focus. So let's take a look at one more here on the slide. And we've got another setup, and as always, we skip to the question stem. We see most weakens, so which of the following, if true, most weakens the claim about Canadian schools? We know the claim has to be about Canadian schools, so that's a little bit helpful. So as always, we'll begin reading at the outset. We find Canadian schools must implement daily aerobics to make their school children healthier. And must implement is already kind of telling me that there's plan involved. And so they've got a recommendation here. Then we get the evidence. In India, school children spend at least 15 minutes per day participating in aerobic activities, and they have been shown to perform better in several physical fitness metrics than their Canadian counterparts. So the school children are performing better. And so we've got this evidence from India that is leading to why we have to implement the plan for Canadian schools. So our explicit conclusion is, of course, the full plan in the introductory sentence, that Canadian schools must implement daily aerobics to make their school children healthier. And we can broadly predict what the correct answer should do, and that's going to weaken the argument and show that the plan to implement daily aerobics is not necessary or otherwise won't work to make Canadian school children healthier. So we introduce our answer choices, of course, and move to elimination based on our common wrong argument reasons, including vague impacts. And we see choice D, Canadian school children have historically resisted participating in mandated exercise. Wonderful. Historically, like how far back in history, I have no idea. And I don't know if they are going to continue to resist. There's a lot of different reasons to eliminate choice D. Of course, that also kind of requires some additional information, as does choice A, where we're talking about the health of adults and aerobics having been shown to be beneficial to them and their health as well as the health of children, but we don't necessarily care about adults, or at least need to know how they relate specifically to the school children in the conclusion that is presented and as a metric of evaluating the plan. Now, you also have to be aware of task reversals that strengthen rather than weaken the plan, so show that the plan would work theoretically. So choice B is a little bit kind of roundabout, but saying that Indian school children are known to have diets that are higher in fat and sugar than are the diets of the average school age child. Well, this makes it seem like the Indian school children would be naturally or predisposed to be less healthy than other school children, which means that if they were able to perform aerobics better, it might be because of whatever India is doing differently. So it makes it seem like the aerobics is helping the Indian school children who have poorer diets, and that actually would directly show that the plan kind of works, and maybe we want to do the plan in Canada. And then we have choice E, any time spent exercising is better than no time spent exercising. Again, it's really kind of bland, but I mean, it theoretically would make us seem like we'd want to implement daily aerobics, so we can eliminate E as a bland reversal as well that would strengthen the conclusion. But then choice C, physical fitness priorities vary widely across different countries and cultures. Well, this here gets straight to the idea about the metrics. And we've got India, those school children have been shown to perform better in several physical fitness metrics than their Canadian counterparts. And then we're applying this to Canada. Well, if the physical fitness priorities vary widely, then we may not even really want to measure between India and Canadian school children at all. So this shows that there is a direct kind of way to attack the idea that Canadian schools need to implement this plan for daily aerobics because maybe the physical fitness metrics just aren't a priority in Canada at all. So, our weaken task process. First, identify weaken task by recognizing those key indicator terms such as undermine, weaken, and the presence of an argument with a main conclusion just because the word argument or conclusion is there. Then step 2, read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, noting the explicit conclusion to potentially identify one of our common arguments to help focus on the way the argument is structured in order to predict what your correct answer should be. And if a common argument is identified, you'll be able to more specifically predict what the correct answer should do. But if no common argument is identified, you could use a generic prediction, find info to weaken the conclusion that ... And then step 4, of course, seek a match to your prediction and eliminate choices that fail to address that task by using our common wrong answer choices that you're hopefully familiar with by this point. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and see how we will execute our scratch pad when we encounter weakened tasks in the verbal reasoning, critical reasoning style questions. So as always, we'll start by setting up our scratch work. We've got A through E here, put a little line over top, and we see cast the most doubt on the claim about the egos of modern architects in our question step. So most doubt indicates that we are being asked to weaken that claim about the egos of modern architects. So we're going to just put PW for predicted weaken, and we read from the beginning. So an architectural critic says, for a modern public building to be considered both functional and inviting, it must fit unobtrusively into its surrounding environment. Therefore, modern architects must be willing to set aside their egos to create functional and inviting public buildings. So there's really not a whole lot to go on here. So we might be a little bit held to our standard find info to show that MAs for modern architects can create functional and inviting PBs without setting aside their egos. So if you're being really tight on the reading, you might notice some term shifts because we're talking about a modern public building being both functional and inviting in both the premise and the conclusion. But it says it must unobtrusively fit. into its surrounding environment. So if you are a little bit more attentive, you might note that fitting into the environment doesn't necessarily mean that you have to set aside your ego. So if you're tracing your terms, you might be able to even more specifically predict what the correct answer should do here to weaken. Now, choice A, in the 21st century, public buildings are found in a vast variety of environments. Well, I need more information about that. I mean, that doesn't help me to determine whether our architect needs to set aside their ego. So we can eliminate choice A. Now, the function of a given building can demonstrably affect its design. Okay, again, I don't say that that's wrong, but I need additional information to determine how that would deal with the architect's ego. Now, choice C, unobtrusive buildings are not often recognized for architectural awards. Well, this actually strengthens the argument because if those unobtrusive buildings aren't recognized for architectural awards, well, then the architect would have to set aside the ego because they're probably not going to get any awards. So this is a task reversal. Then we've got choice D. Public buildings more frequently experience cost overruns than do private residences. Well, I mean, we're just introducing a whole litany of new variables that we can just categorize this choice as incorrect for some outside info that's necessary. But then we've got modern architects are more interested in gaining recognition from expert publications than from passing members of the public. Well, this says that it's unobtrusively fitting into the surrounding environment. And we know that it's going to be created, or the building is going to create a functional and inviting public building. So it basically says that the ego comes, or more so, is satisfied by an expert, not the layperson, which shows that the architect really isn't setting aside their ego. They just don't care that it fits unobtrusively into the surrounding environment and isn't going to be recognized by laypersons. They're more interested in getting that recognition from an expert publication that theoretically would be more aware of the skill that was used by making that modern public building fit into its surrounding environment unobtrusively. So let's scroll on down and take a look at one more example here. It's a relatively lengthy one, or at least the answer choices are. So setting up our scratch work once more, we got A, B, C, D, E. Put a little line over top. We see we are being asked to undermine the reasoning above, so that means we need to weaken. And so we'll put PW for predicted way to weaken. And we read direct comparisons of Africanized honeybees and honeybees native to South America have consistently shown that the Africanized bees produce a significantly greater amount of honey during a given harvest period. Okay, that's just a fact. Therefore, fears that a northward migration of Africanized honeybees would decrease North American honey production are clearly exaggerated. So we need to find info to show that the NW, and we'll put a little up arrow for northward migration of the AH for Africanized honeybees will lower NA for North American, HP for honey production. Because it's said before that the fears were exaggerated. But here, if we're going to weaken the argument, we need to show that those fears were not exaggerated and that this northward migration of the Africanized honeybee will lower North American honey production. So, choice A significant amount of honey produced in North America is harvested by hobbyists who are incapable of alternating their techniques to accommodate a change in bee species. Well, yeah, That's it, right? And if you predict well, you're not going to need to predict too specifically to find what the right answer is, because this shows that the AH, the Africanized honeybee, will lower the NA honey production of those hobbyists. So now we can go more quickly through the remaining answer choices. So Africanized honeybees are able to pollinate only a fraction of the plants that rely on native North American honeybees to facilitate the plant's reproduction cycle. Well, we're talking about plants holistically as opposed to honey production. That needs additional info. The migration of the Africanized honeybees from South America to North America could take decades to fully complete. Okay, well, it could take. What if it doesn't? This is incredibly vague. Studies involving the Africanized and South American honeybees were conducted by a joint North American and South American team. Okay, again, wonderful. I have no idea. That needs additional information. And lastly, we've got the natural harvest period of Africanized honeybees is slightly shorter than the natural harvest period of honeybees native to South America. Okay, slightly shorter. I mean, if it's just slightly shorter, that probably has no impact either way, or would need additional information. And we can, again, be a little bit more assertive once we've got that good check mark at choice A. So go ahead and practice some drills of weaken style critical reasoning questions on your own to improve at this very important aspect of the critical reasoning section of the GMAT Focus Edition.